Um, I just want to start by thanking Pastor Talasha and this beautiful, wonderful congregation for allowing me to speak with you this morning. It's such an amazingly beautiful space, so it's an honor to be here. The scripture for today is Matthew 7:24 through 29, and it reads, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astounded at his teachings, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as their scribes. These verses comprise the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Through this sermon, Jesus shares the path of righteousness with his disciples. It is appropriate that he would end with the words he left us. How much better it is to be a wise man than a foolish one, wouldn't you agree? How much richer the world and our relations with one another are when we reside in a house that is built steadfast, built on a solid foundation of rock. This weekend, we are celebrating the birthday of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I would say that he was a wise man who built his house on a rock. He came to prominence in 1955 at the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, and by 1963, he was a recognized world leader, a man who had a dream, who stood for justice and walked a righteous path. He did not embrace this role with pride or hubris, but remained humble and grew into it as circumstances required. He was not someone who gave alms and then boasted about it as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets. He counseled those who followed him to turn the other cheek and to not strike back in anger, but to live a life of love and nonviolence. He believed that we should love our enemies and bless those who cursed us. He was a good man and a wise man who walked the talk, building his house on a rock. And for that, we celebrate his life and his work. This is not to say that he was perfect. He was not. He had flaws as any other man does. But what I want to note is that he walked a path that we would be wise to follow, though that path be not smooth. Toward the end of his short life, Dr. King looked around and saw things happening that offended his consciousness, things to which he could not remain silent. He realized that there was a soul sickness in a nation that went further and deeper than racial injustice. He began to see poverty and militarism and how they were connected to racism and other injustices against people who were vulnerable and despised. Seeing this, he remained steadfast to his moral compass, and he followed the principles that Jesus laid out in the Sermon on the Mount, even as many of his admirers began to fall by the wayside. Dr. King chose the narrow path with its thorns and sharp turns and uneven way. Interestingly, he came to this realization because he had had a measure of success. The goals of the civil rights movement was to end the legal practice of segregation, which was won with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. However, though laws Though laws change, the hearts and minds of those who were empowered did not. And by some indications, conditions for Black people and poor people were getting worse. How could that be? Dr. King came to realize and understand that it was war and greed that was once again thwarting justice. He saw the promise and the hope to finally address the needs of the poor and the downtrodden, Black and white, fall by the wayside as the buildup for the war in Vietnam rolled ahead in full steam. Resources that should have been supporting jobs, housing, healthcare, food for children, and other human needs for life were being diverted and used to destroy the very same things for other people who were downtrodden and poor halfway around the world. Dr. King made an important connection. The war in Vietnam and the violence that was being perpetrated in Southeast Asia was just a reflection of the violence that was being perpetrated right here at home. This was a violence that was evident in the faces of the homeless and the hungry, of those sleeping in the streets and those who were starving in a land of plenty. As a man of conscience, Dr. King had to speak out about what he saw and call attention to the hypocrisy of a nation that was claiming to fight for freedom while simultaneously dropping bombs on children. He also knew that it would be unpopular to do so. He had been warned that he would lose support if he went against the forces that was driving the war. But Dr. King was a man who built his house on the rock. He declared that he was committed to the ministry of Jesus Christ. He was called to speak for the weak and the voiceless, rather than curry the favor of the rich and powerful. When he made his public announcements speaking out against the war in Vietnam, the New York Times printed an editorial a couple of days later admonishing him of his error in uniting the peace movement with the civil rights movement. President Johnson, who had previously saw the political expediency of supporting the civil rights movement and who had signed civil rights legislation, never forgave him. Nevertheless, Dr. King remained true and chose the narrow path, even if it meant walking it alone. He held on to the knowledge that he was answerable to a higher calling. This is why we honor him. At a time, however, many of those who who claimed to support him and care for his cause turned away, choosing the wider and smoother path of conforming to the status quo, of not rocking the boat. They criticized Dr. King and accused him of stepping out of his lane, of sticking his nose into something and somewhere he did not belong. Uniting the civil rights movement and the peace movement would be disastrous to both, they said. We love Dr. King today, but in 1966, he had a 63 unfavorable rating in the general population. The man that we celebrate today was a pariah at the end of his life. It was easy to adore the man who gave us a dream and shun the man who tells us the truth. We have still so much to learn and so far to go. The triple evils of militarism, economic exploitation, and racism that Dr. King identified almost 60 years ago are still too present. A senseless war is being fought in Europe with no end in sight. And regardless of how you feel about the war itself, it is interesting that the government can find billions of dollars to support ending life, but doesn't have the time, doesn't have the same will to find the money to end poverty. We live in a world economy in which some few are fabulously wealthy, while the many struggle for their daily bread. The top 1% now own more wealth than the bottom 92%. And the 50 wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom half of American society. Let me say this a different way. The 50 wealthiest Americans have more wealth than the combined wealth of 165 million people. For the 1% of the 1%, their personal wealth is greater than the GDP of independent countries. Additionally, the set of priorities that generate this disparity, coupled with the way resources are distributed, is leading to the destruction of the environment, perhaps irrevocably changing and diminishing it for future generations. Not to mention that the climate is in crisis, such that catastrophic weather events are the norm rather than the exception. And of course, those most affected are the most vulnerable and historically marginalized in this country and in the global South. Racism and racial injustice remain baked into our institutions and structures, even if they are not as visible as they were when Dr. King was alive. It looks like mass incarceration, health disparities, which became more visible during the pandemic, the racial wealth gap, in which Black Americans have 1/6 the wealth of white Americans on average per capita basis. And another way of putting this is that the median white family has 41 times more wealth than the median Black family, and 22 times more wealth than the median Latino family. And there are many other markers that show this disparity of well-being and flourishing. What does that say about us and our house? Dr. King, not the dreamer, but the truth teller, concluded that racism and economic exploitation were of a cloth. And if we are serious about justice, he told us, we must honestly face the fact that we must address ourselves to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. This, he believed, meant assessing the entire edifice of America's house, its economic system that is built on exploitation, as well as its economic structures that perpetrate the racism and the oppression of Black and other non-white people. Both are inextricably connected. One could conclude that this nation is foolish and built this house on sand. If we look at its history, this is not an unreasonable conclusion. Think about it this way. Its foundation rests upon stolen land taken by the conquest of indigenous people and unconscionable efforts at physical and cultural genocide. Its floors are constructed on the backs and blood of stolen people who were forced to labor within and without, often under the lash or the noose. Its walls and interior were built on the laps and wombs of women who remain subordinate to men who want to control their bodies for men's own pleasure and power. Its roof is tiled with the misery and sorrow of the poor and the permanent underclass, whose very presence is necessary for the existence of the super rich. This house, Dr. King believed, and I agree with him, is beyond reform. We have to restructure the whole of American society. This means that we have to build this house in which some few take comfort and many others suffer. We have to move its foundation from sand onto a rock. It has to be done in word and deed. It seems a daunting task, almost beyond our capacity. But I want to emphasize the almost. Because though it is hard and demands a commitment on our part, the direction and the process is actually quite simple. The trailhead to the narrow path is clearly marked. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we will stumble along this path, but if we are forthright and sincere, others will be there to help us along the way. When we do justice, we are never alone. And I want to end with the verse from the book of Micah, and I've seen it scattered around the church here, but it's one that's always meant a tremendous amount to me and one that I carry deeply inside. And I was reminded of it by a dear friend as a reminder of the only thing that's really asked of us. It's simple, but it's clear that what is required to live a life of goodness and care is stated in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has showed thee, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of thee? But to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with thy God. Amen. Thank you.